So I'm going to talk about behaviorism and the inner life, the inner world. And to begin with, the main tenet of behaviorism was formulated by John Watson just over 100 years ago, 110 years or so, 1913. He wrote what has been afterwards called the Behaviorist Manifesto in a paper. And he said that psychology is a purely objective experimental branch of natural science. Its theoretical goal is the prediction and control of behavior. Introspection forms no essential part of its methods. So why did he say that? Well, these are a number of central ideas of behaviorism and the reasons for them. For instance, subjective reports are unreliable and unusable for science. This was observed by Ivan Pavlov, who introduced the concept of conditioning, nowadays called classical or Pavlovian conditioning. And Pavlov, as you know, conditioned dogs. He measured salivation, and he presented the sound of a metronome. He gave the dogs meat powder in their mouths, which caused salivation. And after pairing these two events, the metronome sound and the meat powder, the dog would eventually start salivating at the sound of the metronome. He became famous for this. His Nobel Prize was not for that, though, but for his studies of secretion, the gastrointestinal tract. But Pavlov noticed in his lab that when his colleagues tried to describe what happened to the dogs, they would often talk about the dog, for instance, expecting the food. It started salivating to the sound because the sound made it expect the food or anticipate the food. And his colleagues used these kinds of mentalistic concepts, but they could never agree on what they were describing. So Pavlov introduced a prohibition in the lab to using subjective language. So even though Pavlov never formulated a behaviorist belief system, he was very important for developing this idea and for starting the idea of an objective science of behavior. Someone like Watson would say that mental phenomena are essentially behavior. That's what they are. And he would also say that subjective experience exists, but it is inaccessible to a science. So that does not mean that he sort of denies the existence of consciousness or that he denies the existence of some kind of inner reality. It only means that these things should not form part of a science of behavior or of psychology. A school of thought known as the logical empiricists and many others claim that mentalistic terms actually do refer to observable behavior. This was not limited to psychology. They would also say that things like magnetic fields or gravitation or electrons should be defined in terms of observables. They must eventually be reducible to what we can see or hear or feel. And this, of course, played an important part of psychology, and it was picked up by behaviorists. So they would say that mentalistic terms actually refer to observable behavior. This man, Gilbert Ryle, was not a logical empiricist. He was part of what is later become known as Oxford philosophy, very much inspired by the later Wittgenstein. And he claimed that most psychological terms actually do refer to behavior, but not any kind of behavior. He would say, for instance, that if you have an aggressive personality or if you are a very generous person, it refers to a disposition to behave in a certain way in certain situations. So these are dispositional terms, and he claimed that most psychological terms can be analyzed in this way. And Ryle, although he didn't consider himself to be a behaviorist, was considered by many others to be a behaviorist. What other psychologists or behaviorists would say was that mental mediators like desires, goals, etc., are not really necessary for understanding behavior. And the person most responsible for formulating this was B.F. Skinner, who sometimes is called not a behaviorist, but a radical behaviorist. Some would be very, very surprised to hear that he was a radical behaviorist in the sense that he really did think that thoughts and desires and such things should be part of an experimental science, but he had a special view of what these things were. He called it radical behaviorism, but he did not deny that deny the existence of inner reality. He just said that inner reality actually is behavior. I will come back to that. So Skinner's main claim was that many of the mentalistic terms that we use are not really useful. They are useless for explanation. And to give you a very, very simple example of from classical conditioning, this is a man, he gets a puff of air to his eyes, and that causes him to blink. If you precede that with a tone a number of times, he will blink in response to the tone even before the air puff reaches the eye. Now, how would we want to explain that? I think that most people, if they knew nothing about the underlying science, the physiology or anything, they would say, well, he has a desire to avoid this unpleasant experience of having an air puff to the cornea. So when he hears the tone, he expects the air puff. And therefore, he makes a decision to blink in advance of the air puff. That would sort of be consistent with everyday psychology. But if you know what happens, and we know quite a lot about this, the tone enters the ear, goes into the brainstem, electrical signals are follow the so-called mossy fibers up to the cerebellum, where granule cells fire, send signals to Purkinje cells, and if that coincides with a signal coming from the cornea, the Purkinje cell learns to change its response to the input through these fibers, and it learns to send out a signal that causes a blink. So we know a lot about the details of what's happening here, and you will not see here or find it useful to refer to expectations or anticipation, anything like that. These terms become completely pointless once you know what is really going on in here. Skinner formulated another form of learning. Essentially, the rat presses a lever when a green light is on and a food pellet falls down. That reinforces the behavior of pressing the bar or the lever, and the rat will learn to do that with a higher and higher frequency corresponding to its need for food. Skinner would never explain that in terms of what the animal, the rat learns or expects or wants or anything like that. This is what you observe. And he maintained that almost all behavior is learned in this way, even human behavior. And he found this an extremely amusing cartoon. Someone did it to sort of to make a joke of Skinner. This is a rat telling the other rat, boy, have I got this guy conditioned. Every time I press the bar, he drops in a piece of food. And Skinner loved this cartoon because it illustrated the fact that even the scientist is subject to operant conditioning. The scientist interacts with his subject matter, behavior of rats, and becomes reinforced for some behaviors and not for others, and so on. So this was, for Skinner, sort of a deep and very, very truthful phenomenon. Now, Skinner had another reason for dismissing reports of subjective experience, and he formulated a version of what is later become known as the private language argument. It was really formulated by Wittgenstein, and not a lot of people know that Skinner formulated almost exactly the same argument. The idea is this: we learn language from the verbal community. And when we are saying that this is a dog, we get reinforced or rewarded. If we say it's a cat, we do not. So we learn from other people, but it requires that other people can see the same things as we do. So I look at, when I'm a child and I don't know what these animals are, and I say this is a cat, and my parents or my friends can say, no, it's not, it's a dog, and I gradually learn via the reinforcement from the verbal community. But we also have private stimuli arising within our bodies. And those are private, those are not, it's not possible for the verbal community to correct me, reinforce me, if I am saying that I have the experience of such and such. So therefore, the private language becomes very, very unreliable. Skinner also claimed that all behavior is learned. There is no innate knowledge, and this is sort of a well-known tenet of behaviorists. But it caused problems for Skinner. And the reason is that Skinner wrote a book, what he regarded as his crowning achievement, on verbal behavior, where he tried to explain language in terms of operant conditioning. And the book was reviewed by Noam Chomsky. This was in, I think, 1959 or something like that. Chomsky was extremely dismissive of Skinner, and he had, in this review, he made a couple of very, very important arguments. One was that there really is innate knowledge. Our knowledge of grammar, for instance, is inborn. So this again goes very much against the behaviorist idea. But he also claimed that many of the ways that Skinner defended behaviorism were unscientific. For instance, Skinner did not deny that there are thoughts, desires, feelings, and so on. But what he said was essentially, thoughts are also behavior. Now you could say that's really cheating. You just, people would criticize him, and Chomsky did, and saying, well, if you say that these things are behavior, you are sort of defining things so that your theory becomes correct. So this is pure nonsense. You have no independent evidence of anything like covert behavior. But neuroscience now comes to the rescue. The idea was actually formulated a long time ago, in the middle of the 19th century, by this man, Alexander Bain, who is now largely forgotten. He is known mainly as the founder of the academic journal Mind, the most important philosophical journal for a long time. He formulated some things about covert behavior that, again, was largely forgotten, but I think is now becoming more interesting, and there's also a lot of empirical evidence for it. He said, for instance, the tendency of the idea of an action to produce the fact shows that the idea is already the fact in a weaker form. Thinking is restrained speaking or acting. So if I speak with a lower and lower voice, I turn down the volume, eventually you won't hear anything. But and I would think, oh, I'm just thinking it. But actually it's the same thing as saying it. It's verbal behavior, but with a lower volume. We now have a lot of evidence that this really does occur. So if I, for instance, you may know about neuroimaging. You can measure blood flow, activity in various parts of the brain during particular types of behavior. And if you ask someone to, let's say, flap their hand or something like that, you will get increased activity. Say it's the right hand, then the left hemisphere will increase its activity. Then you ask the subject, now don't move your hand, but imagine that you're moving your hand. And you will get activity in exactly the same part of the brain. Maybe to a slightly lower degree, but basically the same thing happens. Suggesting that thinking that you are performing behavior is really the same thing as performing the behavior. And there is also evidence that we can simulate perceptions. You can see things if you are imagining them. So if you are looking at the visual areas of your brain, when a subject is looking at a light and you measure what is happening in the visual area of the brain and also at another part of the brain, and what you can see is that the activity goes up in the visual areas, but it remains the same in other areas. Then you turn the stimulus, the light off, and you ask the subject, now imagine that you are seeing the light. And you will again see an increased activity in the visual area of the brain. Similar.
That was a very long final minute, German.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
I know.
Thank you for listening. Thank you for speaking.